Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I'm going to talk to you about an innocuous skill, a skill that most people would never even consider to be a skill, but one that could have an amazing impact on your life. In this episode, I'm talking about breathing. So before we dive into breathing as a whole, we have to acknowledge, we have to ask, is breathing even a skill at all? And most people would argue, no, it's not a skill. It's something that everyone can do. Everyone breathes, so how could it be a skill? But I would argue that breathing is absolutely a skill, and it's a skill that's the foundation for life itself. I would argue that breathing is a skill because it's an action that we can perform. We can choose when and how we breathe, and there are direct outcomes based on how we breathe and what we do. We can train our breathing so that we can breathe in a certain way. We can actively train our breathing so that we can passively breathe in a certain way. That's how I should have phrased it. And how we breathe can affect nearly every aspect of our lives, including sleep, mental health, physical health, performance, and much, much more. So, as we go into this episode, I'm going to be pulling information from a number of sources. So, I've had the chance to look through a number of scientific papers on breathing. I've had the chance to listen to podcasts and talk to medical experts. I've done some research on Wim Hof, known as the Iceman. He's not the most scientific in his methods. However, he is very well known for his Wim Hof breathing technique. And finally, I did as much research as I really could, trying to dig into the masters of breathing, the Shaolin, Buddhist, and Tibetan monks, who have mastered many forms of breathing and have been able to perform seemingly superhuman feats thanks to the power of their breath. So, before we really dig into this, why should you care about how you breathe? It's commonly said that, well, perhaps not commonly said, but it's said that how you breathe will determine the quality of your life. The better you breathe, the higher the baseline quality of life you're going to have. So, based on that, some of the basic effects that you can get from improving your breathing include, but are certainly not limited to, getting better sleep. By breathing properly, you're going to be able to sleep better. You're going to be able to circulate oxygen through your body much better, sleep more soundly, perhaps even stop snoring. You're going to have better mental and emotional regulation, or conversely, if you worsen your breathing, you can actually force and cause yourself to have panic attacks through improper breathing. And most people are breathing, perhaps not improperly per se, but could be breathing better. Some even say that proper breathing can give you control over your body temperature, healing adrenaline rushes, and other aspects of your body that you might not normally be able to control. And proper breathing can even aid in giving you a more appealing facial structure. Mouth breathing tends to cause a lowered and recessed jaw, droopy eyes, and a number of other less favorable aesthetic features. How you breathe really does matter, and it's going to affect every aspect of your life, whether you realize it or not. And yet, breathing isn't something that we really learn how to do. It's not something that we study. It's not something that many of us give any second thought to. We just are born and start breathing one day, and then never stop until we die. And that's the most that people really put into the idea of breathing. Yet when we really look at breathing from a scientific perspective and from a spiritual perspective, both of them, when you look at breathing from these lenses, you can see just how much impact how we breathe really can influence our lives. Next, I want to delve into what breathing is like from a scientific perspective. So, what are the mechanics to breathing? How does this really work? This is the foundation of everything else that I want to go into today on how to breathe, how to treat breathing as a skill. So what's really going on behind the scenes? How do we breathe? And It's essentially, this is how it works. We have the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. The diaphragm is a muscle that's sort of below the lungs that can essentially scrunch down or lower down to expand, to open up more space for the lungs to fill up. And the intercostal muscles are muscles located in between the ribs that can also expand to help essentially open up space for your lungs to draw in air. So when these muscles expand to force air into the lungs, there are alveoli, or air sacs, that create more surface area inside the lungs for oxygen and CO2 to be sort of transmitted through them. From there, well, it's important to say this, we need both oxygen and carbon dioxide when we breathe. It's not just oxygen. We often think that oxygen is the good stuff, that's the stuff that we really need, and CO2 is the bad stuff, that's all the stuff that we breathe out. We don't care about that, we want that gone. But that's further from the truth. We desperately need CO2 to be properly functioning human beings, and there are problems that come up when we either have too much carbon dioxide or too little carbon dioxide. So, as with everything in biology, everything needs to be in a proper balance, or in homeostasis, as we typically say it in a scientific way if you want to be all highfalutin and fancy about it. So, we need both oxygen and carbon dioxide when we breathe. Think of oxygen as the fuel that powers everything in our body. So when we breathe in oxygen and carbon dioxide. These two molecules are going to latch onto our blood cells, or specifically the hemoglobin of our blood. From there, as our blood gets transmitted or pumped throughout our body, the CO2 will act as a sort of kickoff point where the carbon dioxide will kick off the oxygen wherever it needs to go. Then the blood will continue to pump through the body, eventually coming back to the lungs, the heart. I'm gonna be honest, I don't entirely know what I'm talking about here, but from my understanding, it's that the blood will eventually get back to the lungs as a sort of refueling station where we can breathe out a good portion of our carbon dioxide, finally to restart again as we breathe in, get more oxygen and CO2 to continue pumping blood, oxygen, CO2 all throughout the body to get everything where it needs to go. And like I mentioned earlier, you can experience a wide array of problems from having either way too much oxygen, way too little oxygen, or way too much CO2, or way too little CO2. There's so much that goes into the mechanics of breathing, but boiled down to it in simplicity, really, this is what it is. We breathe in, we get oxygen, we get CO2. It attaches to blood, that blood transfers throughout our body. Carbon dioxide kicks the oxygen out wherever it needs to go. And then finally, we get refueled to keep going over and over and over again. So that's how breathing works in a nutshell. Now looking at breathing from a spiritual perspective, you might think, that's not too important, because in Cast of All Trades, it's all about developing your skills, and it's all about being able to do things. Who cares about the spiritual side of things? But another aspect of being a jack of all trades is being able to think, being able to understand, learning about different ideas and ideologies. Plus, it's interesting learning about the history of breathing as a, both spiritual and physical medical practice, because really the spiritual side of breathing, we tend to associate that we tend to think that it stems from the Eastern philosophies, specifically around China, and China treating breathing as a medical practice of sorts. In many places, in many temples, breathing is seen as a sort of essence of life and is taught in temples. One of the first lessons that many young monks will learn is how to breathe properly. And I personally think that's kind of amazing. Think that you're not worried about teaching a lot of these young kids how to read, how to write. You're not worried about teaching them mathematics. Instead, when you bring them to the temples, you're teaching them about their body. You're teaching them about how to live, how to take full advantage of what they've been given. And by teaching them how to breathe, these monks are being taught essentially how to control their lives, how to control their mind, how to control their bodies. So I know I've already touched on that a bit, but I just wanted to restate how amazing that kind of is, and how I think it's kind of strange that we don't really talk about this in our like more Western or modern day schooling systems, just because how amazing breathing really can be for us. Anyways, back to the spiritual perspectives of breathing. In many temples, it's common to associate the number of breaths taken per minute with the length of someone's life, and there's a good reason for this. When you look at the length of life of many animals compared to the number of breaths they take per minute, dogs, I'm pretty sure it's somewhere between 16 and 20 breaths per minute that they'll take. For humans, we, on average, do about, like, I want to say it's 10 to 12, and turtles or tortoises tend to take about, I want to say it was 5 to 6. And typically, just based on a lot of the animals that many of these monks will compare or consider or look at, the fewer breaths that someone takes per minute, the longer lifespan that they have in terms of years. So, a strange quirk that you might find in some of these more spiritual practices or spiritual beliefs of temples is that they don't necessarily count life in the number of months or years that someone has lived, but, well, they will probably still do that, but they often view life in the number of breaths that someone has taken, where they view someone's life as essentially a countdown, where someone may have a certain number of breaths that they may take. So by breathing better or by taking deeper, longer breaths, they're literally protracting their lives, like expanding it out to be upwards of 100 years or so. That's what their thoughts, their beliefs might stem from. So, keeping all this in mind, what are some simple things that you can do to improve your breathing if you want the simplest, bare bones, okay, Orion, you've talked about the medical side of breathing, you've talked about the spiritual side of breathing, you've talked a bit about that it is beneficial to you. You haven't really said how exactly, but if I want to get the most bang for my buck when it comes to breathing, what would I do? So, from the research I've done and from just trying out a couple different things that many of these papers, many of these medical professionals, and many of these monks have said, the simplest way to breathe that is considered healthiest for everyday life is as follows. In through the nose, fill the lungs, out through the mouth, pause, and repeat. This should be about 4 deep breaths per minute, or 6 to 8 shallower breaths per minute. And, well, many of us will actually breathe much more than this. This is called overbreathing, and I'll dig into that a little bit more later. But essentially for what's considered the healthiest and best for everyday life is that 4 deep breaths per minute, or 6 to 8 shallow breaths per minute, when most people will actually do about somewhere between like 8 to 12, like either deep or shallow breaths. It's kind of complex from what I've seen so far, but essentially most people are actually overbreathing, which isn't doing them super well. So to dig into this a little bit more, the idea is to fill your belly, lowering your diaphragm, your intercostal muscles expanding out, your shoulders often rising, and most of this will happen naturally just by breathing in through the nose, slowly, and breathing out through the mouth. And on top of this, one important thing to get across is that you are breathing in through your nose, or doing nasal breathing as most people call it. This is more difficult than mouth breathing, but there are many other benefits that you get from nasal breathing. You tend to get more air in by nasal breathing. The extra force needed to breathe in through the nose causes it to ultimately be more efficient than breathing in through your mouth. And nasal breathing comes with a whole host of other benefits that I'll touch on here and there as I go through a couple other things when it comes to breathing. So, Next, I want to dive into a bit of the actual breathing techniques, their uses, and their explicit purposes. So I've already touched into the daily living of what's the most optimal way to breathe throughout your daily life, and that's great and all, but what about when I'm sleeping? What about when you're sleeping? Many people believe that they don't have much control over how they breathe while they sleep, or many people may experience something like sleep apnea. This is often experienced by heavier folks, whether that be people who are overweight with too much fat or even people who are overweight with too much muscle. Essentially, what's behind sleep apnea is that the point of it is that they're not getting enough air into their body while they're sleeping. And this is also often seen in people who snore or people who are breathing through their mouths while they sleep. So there are a couple different strategies that people have tried over the years to try to fix this and to improve their breathing while they sleep. But there's one that's super cheap, super easy, that has been shown to improve your breathing while you sleep very, I guess, like I said, very quick, very easy, very cheap. Most people who have sleep apnea will right away dive over to their CPAP machine, and well, that's great. It's very expensive. It's a big hulking machine that you have to strap up to every single night. And if we're being totally honest, one, I am not a medical professional, and this is not medical advice. However, most people who have pretty light sleep apnea, they could actually totally scrap their CPAP machines and try something different. What they can do is they can try to sleep with either medical tape covering their mouth or closing their jaw. This is to try to force them to keep their mouth closed as they sleep, to try to get them to do more nasal breathing, because nasal breathing as you sleep is going to get you more air and it's likely going to be adequate enough for you to get over your sleep apnea and get better sleep. This alone could potentially fix your snoring and sleep apnea problems. Like I said, not a medical professional. However, there have been studies that have shown this to be true. And on top of this, as you're trained to breathe through your nose in your sleep, this could also help you train yourself to breathe through your nose in your day-to-day life if you aren't already doing that. Another benefit that I want to briefly touch on of breathing through your nose in your day-to-day life is one that I briefly touched on earlier of what's one of the effects of improving your breathing. And that was improving your breathing, or proper breathing, can even give you a more appealing facial structure. So you can actually look this up online and it's super fascinating. But there is a distinct difference between people who breathe through their nose and people who breathe through their mouths. People who breathe through their mouths tend to have a more recessed jawline. They tend to have looser features. Everything seems to be a bit more droopy compared to those who breathe through their nose, who are nasal breathers. They tend to have a stronger jawline. They tend to be more focused. Things tend to be more tight or more pulled back. And it's a night and day difference, even in the bone structure, how bones can realign by changing the way you breathe. If you've been a mouth breather for a long time, you can actually restore many of the more facially appealing facial structures by changing to nasal breathing over a long period of time. It's amazing seeing these transformations from what they were to what they can become. If you want to see this in action, just look at side-by-side images of people who are mouth breathers versus people who are nose breathers. Try to look at x-rays and bone structures of that, because that's the most prevalent. Another aspect of daily living and breathing that I want to touch on is hiccups. We've all experienced hiccups, and it's a pain. It's irritating, and people will gladly give us their advice on this is how you fix hiccups, by drinking from the other side of the glass, by dancing on your head and doing whatever XYZ other random things. When in reality, there is actually a quote-unquote cure to hiccups, according to research that has been shown to work time and time again for a large majority of people. Some people can get the drink from the other side of the glass thing to work, whatever that really means. But if you want to get rid of your hiccups scientifically through breathing, this is how you do it, step by step. You inhale 3 times through the nose, 1 deeply, one to fill up your lungs and the last one to fill up even more. These last two are probably going to be sharp breaths in. The last one might even just be a microsecond of you trying to do it, but the idea is to fill your lungs to total capacity with 3 breaths, hold your breath for 15 to 20 seconds, and then slowly exhale. What this is doing is it's essentially, think of it as hard resetting your lungs and your breathing system as a whole. I don't remember the name right now of the exact system that it's essentially resetting, but when your hiccups are happening, there's this system in your brain that's essentially triggering your body to do hiccups over and over and over again until it can finally either calm down or just reset through this method. So if you want to cure hiccups, the best way to do it through breathing scientifically, 3 inhales in, 1 deep, 1 to fill up, last one to fill up even more, hold it for 15 to 20 seconds, and then exhale slowly. So that's most of the stuff when it comes to breathing from day to day. However, there is one other aspect I want to touch on, and that's one that I've touched on a bit before, the idea of overbreathing or hyperventilation. When most of us think of hyperventilation, we think of someone sitting down or having a panic attack, just quickly breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, or maybe they're breathing into a bag a bunch. Well, that is sort of hyperventilation, but that's not the primary form of hyperventilation that most of us are actually doing. Like I mentioned before, the optimal style of breathing is to have 4 deep breaths in per minute or 6 to 8 shallow breaths in per minute. Most of us are doing much, much more. And basically what's happening is that when someone is overbreathing or hyperventilating, is that they're actually spitting out too much carbon dioxide. So they're breathing in a bunch, but they're also exhaling a bunch of carbon dioxide. They're bringing in a bunch of oxygen. They think, yes, this is a good thing. This is going to calm me down. But in reality, they're kicking out too much carbon dioxide, so they can't take full advantage of the oxygen that they're taking in. They're only actually getting about 60 to 70% of the oxygen that they breathe in that'll make it to their brain or other parts of the body that'll need it. And ultimately, this leads to a couple issues. 1, it leads to us being worse at processing information. 2, it leads to increasing anxiety. And 3, it leads to extra brain excitability, i.e., tons of random noise and brain stimulation. And this can actually also cause seizures in many people. If you're prone to seizures, hyperventilating is one quick way to easily cause you to have a seizure. So what can you do about this? How can you try to cut back on your constant overbreathing? And there's a couple different strategies for this, but there's one that I really like that has been shown to do really well at helping people slow down their breathing over time to get them to be closer to that optimal 4 deep breaths in or 6 to 8 shallow breaths in per minute, and doing that at a more natural pace without them having to manually think about it. This technique is called box breathing, or a box breathing exercise, and it's designed to help you mitigate natural overbreathing. So here's how it works. It's relatively simple. You inhale, hold, exhale, hold, repeat. And time will vary for each person. Just do your own research. It's pretty interesting. But essentially, it's just getting to the habit of breathe in, hold the breath, exhale, hold the breath. I guess not necessarily hold the breath on the exhale, but pause, wait to breathe in again, and then keep doing that. Note that breathing exercises do help. They do help you change your natural unconscious breathing. Even though these exercises are something you're doing manually, it'll often translate over to your unconscious breathing over time. You probably won't notice it, at least at first, but over the next few days, weeks, even months, you should be able to notice a distinct change in your breath, a distinct change in your breathing, that you can naturally slow down your breathing more, that things are just feel different, just feel a bit better. So what are some other things we can think about when learning about breathing and what can we do with our breathing? Well, another aspect of breathing is heart rate. Heart rate is closely tied to breathing, and after tons of studies, here's what we've come to. It's actually very simple. In general, inhales increase heart rate, and exhales decrease heart rate. So, with that in mind, it's actually really simple. If you want to alter your heart rate, you can do the following. You increase your heart rate by taking longer or more vigorous breaths in. If you want to decrease your heart rate, you take longer or more vigorous exhales. And this is central to most breathing techniques all over, whether it be Tumo or Wim Hof or like other meditation styles of breathing. In essence, a lot of it is about controlling the heart rate. It's about learning how to either increase the heart rate when you want it or decrease the heart rate when you want to slow down. And everything is based on this simple principle. So moving on from there, what about breathing to reduce stress and anxiety? Once again, there are a couple different strategies for this, but research cites that there is one specific strategy, one type of breathing, that many of us actually already do, or that we've seen in nature plenty. If you've had a dog, you've definitely seen this for sure. But this type of breathing is called cyclical sighing, and it's quite simple. So to do it, you perform a inhale through the nose as deeply as you can, do a second sharp inhale again to fill that last little bit, and finally sigh out the air through the mouth with a long exhale. And studies have shown that even doing this once is considered the fastest way to calm down in almost any situation. In fact, even long term, just doing this time and time again has shown to be far more calming and far more focus inducing than meditation alone. So when you're looking at trying to reduce stress and anxiety, if you just need to do this in a quick instant, it's great. You have someone swerve in front of you in traffic and you have a spike of anger, you just want to calm down quick. Inhale through the nose as deeply as you can, do a second inhale, sharp, and then sigh it all out through the mouth, a slow exhale. This is shown to be the quickest way to calm someone down in almost any situation. And what about for a 24-hour period if you want to be calmer just throughout the day? Doing this for about 5 minutes, just cyclical sighing of breathe in, exhale, sigh. Just repeat that for about 5 minutes has shown to help you remain at a lower, calmer, just more chill level throughout a 24-hour period. Another interesting thing about this cyclical sighing is that it can actually also help out with certain kinds of cramps you might experience during exercises. And speaking of exercise, what about breathing during exercises? How can you do that to be more efficient in breathing? So when you have cramps on the right side, it's likely due to poor breathing. So for that, go ahead and perform some cyclical sighing. Breathe in through the nose, another sharp inhale through the nose, sigh out through the mouth, and do that a couple times, and the cramps on the right side should alleviate a bit. Typically, we'll see that when we're running and haven't had it's most commonly seen in running or other cardio-like activities. When you're exercising, you want to generally exhale when you're performing more directional voluntary movements, such as if you're doing gymnastics, or this is commonly seen in something like martial arts or throwing or something like that. I'm going to use boxing as an example since it's something I'm a bit more familiar with. When you're seeing boxers or seeing martial artists, it's common to see that whenever they throw a punch, they're going to do a sharp exhale, or just some sort of soft, sharp exhale as they throw the punch. There's something about that allows people to be more on point, to release more energy, and just be more directed with what they're doing. There's a lot more information I could go into about breathing during exercise, but that has its own whole host of eccentricities or minute details that are going to differ from exercise to exercise. But generally, what you want to keep in mind is that if you're doing something that requires direction, voluntary movement, and very pinpoint accuracy, you want to generally exhale during those motions, during those exercises. And another thing to keep in mind is that mouth breathing during exercise think for most exercises is generally all right, but overall, you still want to focus on trying to be more of a nose or nasal breather whenever possible. And the last bit I briefly want to touch on for breathing during exercise is the idea of altitude training and adjusting to altitudes. A lot of people have heard about like professional athletes going up to run across mountains when they're training, or just going up a couple thousand feet to start training before a big event. And there's a good reason for this. So there is some interesting science behind altitude training and trying to get adjusted to like breathing at higher altitudes or fitness at higher altitudes versus lower altitudes. So to keep it simple, people have an easier time breathing when the air pressure outside their bodies, i.e. lower altitudes, is higher than the pressure within their lungs. So typically, the lower the pressure, the lower the altitude you're at, the higher the air pressure is going to be, because there's more air on top of the air you're breathing in. There's more air in the atmosphere above you, pressing down on the stuff you're breathing in, than what's naturally going to be in your lungs. So when you climb up and go higher in altitude, the air pressure outside of your lungs and the inside of your lungs gets closer to being about equilibrium. Therefore, you have a much harder time trying to force air into your lungs than you would down at sea level. This has some interesting implications when it comes to training and athletes. Basically, if they can get adjusted to training at a higher altitude where their breathing is much more forced, much more labored for the next few days, or I'm not entirely sure the exact time frame, but for a certain period of time after training at high altitudes, when they come back down to sea level or to a lower altitude, they're going to continue to breathe in with a naturally greater force. And in doing so, they breathe in more oxygen and more carbon dioxide, and that injects into their muscles, into their brain, much better than those who did not do altitude training for the next few days. So in general, if you get used to training at high altitudes, then perform at low altitudes, you're going to see a noticeable performance boost in basically everything that you do. So keep that in mind if you happen to have a mountain nearby you want to go climb, or you have an altitude training mask or something like that. Another aspect of breathing that you might be familiar with or might have heard of is the Wim Hof method, or Tumo inner fire breathing. These are two they're very similar, so I'm going to group them together. But essentially, these are types of breathing that have been done by Wim Hof, a guy known as the Iceman, who has many world records for like cold therapy, or not necessarily cold therapy, but surviving in cold temperatures. He would climb mountains or climb certain peaks in nothing but his underwear while he's in the middle of a blizzard, or swim in ice cold water, or stuff like that. And similarly, Tumo breathing is considered, it's also called inner fire breathing, and it's a common style of breathing amongst, I want to say it's the Tibetan monks who do it, or at least that's the people who I closely associate with it. But when you look at the actual practice between these two types of breathing, they're very similar, and they both focus on the same concept, that being cyclical hyperventilation, and that basically inhaling deeply and passively exhaling, and doing that for around 20 to 25 reps, then doing a final big exhale of all your breath, hold it for 15 to 30 seconds, and repeat. And this has some pros and cons. It can be kind of dangerous for some people to do, depending on your surroundings, and this certainly can cause panic attacks, because as part of your hyperventilation of inhaling deeply and then exhaling, then the deep exhale following that, you're pushing out a lot of CO2. And essentially what you're doing in this process is that you're triggering an adrenaline release in your body. It's a self-induced biological stress, which does have its own pros and cons to it. So one of the big pros to it is that it can adjust people to being able to be calm in stressful situations. If you can force yourself to learn how to teach yourself to be calm when you do this self-induced biological stress by either having too much or too little carbon dioxide in the system, I honestly kind of forget which one it is when you have cyclical hyperventilation, if it's either too much or too little carbon dioxide in the system. I just know it's one of them. And ultimately, the result of it is that it will release adrenaline and I believe it's epinephrine into the system, where that's going to cause biological stress in the body. You're going to have like a fight or flight reaction. And by doing this in a self induced state, it should help you in general throughout life as you naturally fall into these states of being stressed, whether it is the person swerving in front of you causing an instant fight or flight response, or whatever the situation might be. So that's one of the big perks of cyclical hyperventilation and the Wim Hof / Tumo breathing styles. But there are also a couple other interesting things that can come from it. So first, I want to quickly compare the tenets or the main principles behind Wim Hof breathing and Tumo inner fire breathing. So Wim Hof says his breathing technique relies on three aspects, that being breathing or the cyclical hyperventilation, cold therapy, because that's sort of his thing, sort of what he does, and mindfulness or meditation. Tumo inner fire breathing is very similar, where it's based on breathing, environmental exposure, and visualization. And a lot of the results that you get from these types of breathing are very similar. So Wim Hof's breathing can supposedly teach you to control your automatic nervous system, such as being able to release adrenaline almost on will, like increase muscle tone, work essentially activate your fight or flight response, possibly even work actively somewhat control your digestion or your immune system, and a couple other things. I've seen a lot of weird supposed things that Wim Hof's teachings can supposedly allow you to do, but generally that's the sum of it. Similarly, the inner fire Tumo breathing can supposedly teach you to control your body and its automated systems, similar to Wim Hof's breathing, such as also including your body temperature. And there's a common myth or story that you might hear from monks where there will be a group of monks that will travel up into the mountains, stay the night in a cabin, and then early the next morning in the middle of a blizzard, they'll walk out in their robes, carrying wash basins filled with wet towels. They'll sit on the ground, drape wet towels around themselves, and start to meditate, start to do this Tumo inner fire breathing. And eventually you'll start to see steam rising from the towels and snow slowly start to melt around them. I've seen many monks talk about being able to do this. However, I don't know if I've ever seen any video evidence of it, so I'm going to be tentative about their claims on that. However, both in Wim Hof breathing and Tumo inner fire breathing, we have seen some people being able to be exposed to harsh environments, whether that be extreme cold or extreme heat, and be able to survive quite well, much better than the average person would normally be able to do with just their normal, less optimal breathing techniques. So, last but not least, when it comes to breathing, because of course I have to talk about this, but is there such thing as breathing for learning? And it turns out there is. We actually tend to learn far better while we're inhaling as opposed to exhaling. And my theory for this is that as we're inhaling and blood is rushing to our brains with new oxygen, we're able to more easily bridge connections and create, they have our neurons in our brains, bridge connections and make connections with each other. So that's why we're able to learn things better when we're breathing in than breathing out. And we also tend to perform better and react to things physically when inhaling / exhaling much better. So when you want to learn things, I guess just make your inhales longer and deeper compared to your exhales. So, in summary, breathing is an innocuous skill that many pass by without acknowledging. However, it's a skill that will change your life for the better. If you can control your breath, you can control your thoughts, your emotions, your physical health, and potentially even control your autonomic system, such as being able to release adrenaline on will, be able to adjust the healing of your body, potentially control your internal body temperature, and even more. And if you've enjoyed this episode of Cast of All Trades, I have 3 super easy things I'd like you to do that would mean the world to me. 1, subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss out on our next episode. 2, while you're in your podcast app of choice, give the show a 5-star review. It helps us reach more people and in turn change lives through generalism. 3, share this episode with a friend or two, someone you think would gain a lot from the show. Word of mouth is the best way to help a podcast grow. And if your friend likes the show, they'll thank you for introducing them to it. It's a win-win. With all that said, best of luck, trades.